everyone in.
We're looking back on the international weekend that was, namely England 18, Ireland 7. That's 4 defeats and counting against England. We will see them again in the Six Nations in Dublin next March. Eddie Jones said we controlled most of the game. Andy Farrell said from a defensive point of view, they did a job on us, but there were priceless lessons learned. A couple of the Irish players, interestingly, said that the gap with England is narrowing, they feel. For more, we have Brian O'Driscoll and Keith Wood with us. Gents, you're both very welcome. I might get broad strokes thoughts from you both before we dig into some specifics. Brian, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, yeah. Obviously, it's narrowing if you look at the scoreline, but it's a really strange one where I felt watching the game live that we never really felt as though we had a foothold in the game. It felt like they were in great control. And then you see all the stats churned up and the possession and the territory that we have, and it doesn't all add up. What did we do with all that possession and territory? But then at the same time, you look at some of the performances against England over the last few occasions, the thumping we took in Twickenham before the World Cup, the disappointment in the Aviva last year. So, one thing it wasn't was a capitulation, and it had the potential to be a bit of a humping the way they built their game and took their scores early on, but we certainly didn't throw the towel in. And I think you can take a lot of solace from that, even though I think there is still a substantial gulf in class between the two teams.
Keith, some of those statistics. To our 73 tackles, England made 246 tackles. We had 68% possession, 72% territory and so on. We'd more offloads, we'd more line breaks, but didn't show up in the scoreboard.
No, it was it was a very unusual sort of game, quite a frustrating game to watch in a lot of cases. And I touched on it a little bit last week that England seemed to be trying to build a foundation at the present moment in time. They got embarrassed, I think, by the manner in which South Africa played them in the World Cup last year, where they got bullied out of the game. And they have been used to bullying teams and imposing huge amounts of pressure on teams, and have done that consistently for the last 2 or 3 years. But they seem to just be building a foundation at the moment to do very little. But they were in control of the game. I don't think there's any doubt about that whatsoever. And they didn't try and do anything. It was very, very effective, but quite boring. Now, I presume that they're going to use that as the foundation for them to try and become more expansive without losing any of the controls that they've now really got. So they've played over the last 2 weeks trying to stop Ireland at source, trying to pick on Georgia's strengths to see if they could overpower them, which they did. They kept a great discipline against Georgia and not trying to flash the ball wide to score tries. They tried to beat them up in the forwards, and that just seems to be part of the plan. So I thought they were in control, and we had an awful lot of the ball. I don't know that we challenged them very often. And yes, we had 2 or 3 opportunities to score that we didn't score. But I think that's scant reward for the amount of time we had the ball and the amount of territory we had.
So on that point, in terms of what we're doing with the ball, Brian, I mean, if there's a kind of defining memory in the mind, it's a wall of 13 English defenders across the field, and we are working very, very hard and often going backwards, and it's just, running out of ideas kind of territory. You kind of wonder, have we run out of ideas? I mean, in so many of the analysis pieces we've seen across the last 18 months, 2 years when it comes to Ireland-England games, we're seeing fancy diagrams and there's space in behind this wall of 13 and we need to be exploiting that or putting manners on their line speed. And yet it just feels like we're watching the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, there's a couple of different components to that. I think the first thing is that I think we've struggled at the ruck since Joe Schmidt has left us. Since the World Cup, I think that was a non-negotiable from his perspective. The ball carrier, that well-versed 60% man fighting on the ground, giving a good target to a left barrel and a right barrel, and then a fourth player as security where needs be. Particularly in the first half, I think England absolutely schooled us at the ruck. There was, within a couple of minutes, I think Jameson Gibson Park put a kick up, Keith Earls caught it, And the ensuing ruck, Mako Vunipola, pulled in 5 Ireland players, 6 actually. Peter O'Mahony joined as well. And then Jameson Gibson Park threw the pass behind Caelan Doris to Ross Byrne to do something. Now, England had 13 in the defensive line, Mako in the ruck, and then 1 in the backfield. And what's Ross Byrne meant to do? He's lost half of his team in that ruck, basically. So he goes and goes for an opportunistic kind of cross-field kick because he has no viable options. And I think that was the story of the first half. It felt as though we didn't know how many numbers we had to send to rucks because there wasn't clarity as to how clearly we were going to clear it out. I felt we lost the shoulder to Underwood, to Curry and Underhill. I felt the back row, they really dominated us there. Maybe, Caelan Doris had, parity with Billy Vunipola, but it just felt as though we were always scrambling at ruck time. I thought the referee let both teams lie all over the ball an awful lot. I think he could have refereed that and made it a little bit cleaner early on, and we might have had faster ruck ball to create a better spectacle. But it's an area that I really feel as though Ireland have fallen away from, and they need to go back to, because where we were really good a few years ago, it was our ruck. And partly our collision winning was giving us access into the game and creating a platform for us to actually get some width and get the defensive line on the back foot, whereas England were front foot defensively all game because of the nuisance they caused at ruck time.
Yes. It's quite surprising to hear. It's not like this is a brand new coaching ticket and a brand new bunch of players who haven't realised the importance of being good at ruck time. It's amazing that kind of institutional knowledge and the level of importance that was given to the rucks, Brian, has now been allowed to dissipate to this extent.
Yeah, it was definitely one of Joe's things, from as early as I can remember. And sometimes, you need a coach to have a hang up about something. And sometimes I can understand when you're trying an evolution, it's difficult to give focus to all of the key components or the things that sometimes you take for granted. And when they slip a little bit, I think sometimes you need to cut your cloth a bit and go back and realize what will allow you the platform to be able to play this more elaborate game. Well, it's going to be at ruck time. I feel for someone like Ross Byrne on a couple of fronts. I think if you look at the games that he's been put in charge, England at Twickenham, France came on for 12 or 13 minutes a few weeks ago, England again at Twickenham. Ross Byrne is used to playing in front of a well-oiled machine, a team that gives them go forward. And I don't think he probably has a huge amount of experience of playing on the back foot. But it was an unenviable task for him to try and generate something. Now, I don't think he did a brilliant job of it because he was very static and he was deep and he was shipping the pass on. I think what he probably didn't understand is that to counter a fast defensive line, you have to be aggressive yourself in attack. You've got to take the ball a little bit flatter. You've got to be willing to get hit, and you've got to try and stop that defensive line coming, charging at you. It's inevitably going to happen in the first 3 defenders, but the further out you go, if someone comes at you, the more vulnerable you feel defensively, and something has to give. And it just felt as though we played into their hands by playing super deep, shipping the pass on, and not having a whole lot of deception. It felt as though they were easily able to just number up who their personnel were that they were to tackle. It felt as though there was, very little variety in what we were doing, little switch plays or cross plays or just one pass plays where, you gave scope to creating a bit of confusion in the defensive line. It felt as though that wasn't there. Right. We had some long kind of loopy passes at times that completely, again, played into their hands. So, there was 2 parts to Ross Byrne's performance. I think maybe he didn't help himself, but Janie didn't have the platform, that's for sure.
Keith, that's a brilliantly coherent explanation of everything that's going on there. So the frustration might be, as the armchair experts that we all are, this is not the first time we've played against this type of English defence. This is not Andy Farrell, Mike Catt's first rodeo, and this is about the best we came up with.
Well, and there's that, and there's a bit of chicken and egg with it. And I do think that some of that ruck attention that Joe was famous for had started to drift away from us in the last year. We weren't being quite as effective with it. we were winning the rucks, but we were still going for those little one-out runners, and they were being stopped all the time. And that was one of the issues that happened on the weekend as well. So Byrne was definitely too deep, without a shadow of a doubt. And by being so deep, and the ball is slow, and by being so sleep and shipping the ball on, Farrell and Bundy were getting tackled behind the gain line. Suddenly you get two English players into that ruck, and that slows it down even further, and then you have less opportunities. And we seem to be kind of working our way all the way back. I saw in one of the Leinster games earlier on in this season, it's kind of hard, at the end of last season or whatever it was, that Byrne, totally contrary to what he has done normally, started taking the ball flatter, started a little bit further up the field, and it offers far more options. And to be honest, the defensive line for England at the weekend ignored Byrne, because he got the ball, he didn't keep his hips square, he passed the ball and was almost jogging backwards when he did. They knew he wasn't a threat, they knew he wasn't going to do anything. You suddenly have a flood of players going to attack your 12, 13, 14. And so suddenly you're under an awful lot more pressure there again. So I thought that's a problem, because we cannot play that far back. 7-8 metres, I would have said, at certain instances. But also the one-out runners, they just don't work. Yeah. And the previous week we had against Wales, we started bringing wingers in, inside passes, we started pulling the ball back, we started doing far more. None of that was evident at the weekend. So now we're trying to get, I hope we're getting as much of the negatives out as we possibly can.
Yes.
There are things in this that we need to be able to stand over as well, and say about the age of the team and about some of the experience of the players. And I think that'll be interesting to talk about too. And I do think that some of the comments have been very negative. So for me, for the most part, I would be putting down the big negatives were we were too deep from 10, our line-out was scrappy, and we had one-out runners. And rectifying those, I think, puts us in a very good position.
Brian, no, I'm sure it's not. In terms of the game plan that we're pursuing, so Eddie Jones was on the record even just this week as saying the team that kicks the most wins at the moment. That seems to be where the game is at in his eyes. We had Bernard Jackman on the show yesterday. He was wondering if Ireland are even pursuing the right game plan at the moment, let alone perfecting it. But are we going about our business the right way? Talk to us about kicking, our approach to kicking, what England are doing with kicking. What are you seeing at the game at the moment? Because we're all about heads up rugby, and like we have 5 offloads to their 1 and 6 line breaks to their 3, and like against France, when France do that to us, that's pointed to as well. They beat us in offloads and they beat us in line breaks, and then suddenly when we pip England in that department, it looks slightly irrelevant. So Jones's point about kicking and how maybe we can tease that out based on the game on Saturday.
Yeah, being brutally honest, I didn't focus that much on England's kicking game when I was analysing the game today. If you look at the possession stats, we had 68% possession, and we kicked the ball 35 times. Now that's actually not an awful lot comparable to that amount of possession. And you look at the sequence of it, we kicked the ball 8 times in the first 4 minutes. But I was grading them all, and there were 4 good kicks and 4 poor kicks. So these sort of moments early on give you access into the game. They build territory, they build momentum, and they just start squeezing the opposition. And when you have 50% good and 50% bad, it's very difficult to get a foothold into the game. It's very difficult to squeeze pressure on the opposition, particularly away from home. So it felt as though that was kind of the story for most of the day. There was some really good kicking, some very effective one, no more so than Billy Byrne's chip through. Ross Byrne's chip through for Farrell. Those little moments, they were right on the money.
Should we see more of them? Like I'm looking and seeing those 2 dinks, and you're thinking we've had success with those 2. Why are we not seeing 5 more of them across the game?
And that's the problem. Sometimes, I don't know, do players think because something has worked once, we better not try that again, they'll be expecting it. But an awful lot of the time, teams aren't expecting it. It might soften them a little bit, but they've gone once, right, what have they got next? Or even if they do, if you do it a second time, that even slows line speed all the more to be able to create a play getting out to the width where you've had huge line speed previously. So if something works once, don't be afraid to go back to it again.
Yeah.
You saw, the success that England had with doing that against us in the Aviva last year, where they threw out to the 13-15 channel and then were grubbering through when the fullback was closing the gate, thinking it was going to be needed for a defender, and then rushing huge pressure on the blindside winger that was covering across. Those things are always going to be available to you. So I just think the execution at times was a little bit disappointing. Right. James Lowe in the first few minutes had a couple of block down kicks. It felt as though he never really got into the game, never got an opportunity to show what his skill set is all about. But there were glimmers of hope in it too. Like it's amazing to think that England had a defensive display for the ages, and we had that much possession and territory, and we never felt as though we were going to win the game. But yet, we only lost by 11 points ultimately, and 11 points in international rugby can be gotten in 3 minutes. So it's a really contrasting feeling I have, having watched the game again, as to we were completely outplayed, but you score that Keith Earls try in the first half, or the Farrell one in the second half, and you're right back in the game, and so it does give you some form of hope, even though it felt as though we could have been out there for another while at those driving lineouts that we continually kicked to the corner and not had any success. They just had our number defensively, and sometimes you have to realize you came up against opposition that had their bit between the teeth, and they just weren't going to concede off that.
I was just going to say,
yeah, go on.
Joe, the guys who were good last week, the guys who got a start last week, I think they got a bit of a shock by the level of intensity that was there. There wasn't an ounce of space on the field for them, and they looked rattled. And that happens. That's an experience. That's when you get experience, you understand how to deal with certain things on your second cap or third cap or whatever number it was. For a lot of guys, it's their first time playing in Twickenham, and even without the crowd, it's an imposing place. Playing against a team that are beaten finalists in the World Cup last year, a pretty serious outfit, and that's when you hear comments from Farrell and from James Ryan saying that the guys will learn from this, and people kind of get frustrated with it, fans get frustrated with that, because they take it as this is the Irish rugby team, and the Irish rugby team have done that in the past. You have to build up experience. Sure. You can't just automatically say, well, I'm experienced now because I've played an international rugby game. It takes an amount of time to get into it, and I think that leads to some of the other errors that happened in the game. For some of the players, I was looking at Kelleher and the throwing. How would he know how to react under certain circumstances? He's never played at that level really before, and that is the experience. He will know that he will have to put down his stamp on those lineouts far more than he did at the weekend, that some of the calls were putting him under huge pressure, and the system as it worked for us didn't work perfectly. Even the balls that we got were balls under huge pressure. Now, I've played in those games, and they do happen, and you have to learn from it. Sometimes you actually forget about it, and you have to relearn them. But for these guys, they just have to learn that sometimes you just need to be holding onto the ball in the right area of the field for a period of time.
Yeah, and maybe just expand on the line-out point, because this is not a new problem. Like, ahead of the World Cup in 2019, we were worried about the line-out. It had malfunctioned, badly in the Principality, jumps to mind in advance of that World Cup. And then against France a couple of weeks ago, 3 times in the French 22, Ireland didn't take advantage of their own line-out ball, and then complete systems failure, you'd have to say, against England. So that's a bit more than just the thrower. Obviously, there's something kind of fundamental, a little off at the moment.
Well, there are a few things. One is, and he's gone from it for the moment, Evan Toner is like a lighthouse. You can ping the ball into him. He's a guy you'd love to play with. He'll pick up your bad throws, because he covers a huge amount of the line out. But equally well, I think if you look at the way teams are playing against us, England were very smart the other day. They put Itoje to follow where he thought it was going to go. And as it turned out, he went where we threw nearly every single time. that makes it very, very difficult for a hooker. I would say in Kelleher's throw, he throws an incredibly flat ball and fast ball. And he will learn over a period of time that that is a brilliant ball to have in your armoury, but it's not the only ball that you have. And you could do with having a bit of an arc where the ball dies on the jumper. And you can thread needles that are 10 metres away. That's one of the skills that you build up over a period of time. He just hasn't really needed it. And he hasn't played a huge amount of rugby, so that'll take a bit of time as well. But sometimes you need to have a bailout, throw the ball to the front, make certain that you get it, have a few peel moves that can come down to hooker, to maybe wing forward to the scrum half, anything to try and expand the game out again. So we kept saying that we wanted to throw to the back of the line out because it would open up our game, but we tried to throw to the back of the line out for a pass that would have gone back 7 or 8 yards to 10. We would never have got to the outside because of the manner in which England were defending. So I just think it was a lot of players who hadn't played a huge amount of rugby at that stage, different guys making different calls, and I think we struggled a little. So for me, that can be rectified very quickly, and I think that gets tidied up for not just from changes in personnel, and I don't know that you have to do that, but I think in a high level of attention to detail for what is the reason for a line-out. The reason for a line-out is to win the ball. You would rather win it at the back, it puts you in a more targeted position, but if not, you need to have other things in your armoury.
Brian, at the moment, are we a bit caught between two stools in that you have the champagne rugby France are playing and you have England, militant defence and just kicking the leather off the ball and picking up the crumbs and being brilliant at the breakdown? We're somewhere in the middle, like aspiring to play heads-up rugby, but far too many one-off runners. Do we almost need to go to one extreme or the other in some respects?
But I think the reality is it's dawning on us. We can't get into an arm wrestle with England. We've come off second best against them for the last number of times. So we have to evolve our game in some way. It's funny listening to Keith about it from a back's perspective. Like, off the top ball at 2, granted, you can almost guarantee it, but it is so hard to get an access into the game from a 10-12 channel point of view, trying to crash the ball up. And I heard Ron O'Gara talking about it a couple of weeks ago. If you don't win those first couple of phases at test match level, it is very difficult to get the advantage line after that. And more often than not, it leads to you kicking. So you're caught between, trying to get into the game, but yet also maximizing the opportunity to do that by throwing it to 4 or 6, or alternatively throwing it to 2 and making life very hard for yourself. Now, which is the lesser two evils? Ultimately, having the possession and giving yourself a chance of trying to create something on phase 3 or 4, and then ultimately you might, worst case scenario, have to kick to contest. But it's frustrating from a back's perspective, I suppose. Also, when you've practiced all week, that we're going to be able to provide 4 and 6 ball for you, definitely. And that's what you've done for the whole week, and you understand the numbers that you can stick down on the back of not having as many tail gunners coming off. You don't have Underhill coming charging at your 10, or maybe even 2 coming from Jamie George, as well as Underhill coming at your number 10. And the knock-on effect is this huge line speed from everybody else, not even thinking about drifting. It just makes life very, very difficult. So they are caught between two stools at the moment of trying to evolve their game plan, but I think you do have to learn in real time to cut your cloth when it's not going well for you. That said, you look at the last 4 lineouts. Rob Herring threw to 6, 4, 6, 6, and then 6 on the last one. But Johnny Hill managed to get a hand to it. It was a brilliant lineout steal from him. So I don't think there was anything wrong with that throw. So. Yeah. The accuracy from Herring's throwing was pretty impressive in that last 20 minutes, and it definitely gave Ireland more access into the game and gave them a better chance of advantage line.
And sometimes the game plan can probably be harder for us to deduce when everything's going wrong, and you've talked earlier about what was going on at the breakdown and Ireland weren't necessarily winning collisions. Brian, how did Andy Farrell and Mike Catt picture that going? What was the game plan, with a few things going well, when they had the ball in their hands, all that possession, somewhere, midfield into the English half? What were they actually trying to do that we didn't see?
I'm not entirely sure, to be perfectly honest with you, Joe. It looks different each week, and that's all to do with being on the front foot. You know, the game against Wales was a world apart from what we saw last weekend. I haven't seen as much of the pod of three that they had gone to in those Six Nations matches. Against Italy and against France, it feels as though the timing on them isn't spot on, where there aren't those little tip-on passes. I think it's most likely to come from Doris, if he's the one at second distributor, also with the ability to throw it out the back to the out half. But it does feel as though your game plan is very much dictated by your outside half. And again, we come back to that conversation that the gulf between Johnny Sexton and everybody else is still substantial. And I understand that I'm not answering, the cases. So, what is ultimately the answer? That I don't know.
Right. I would interpret that as a little bit damning if you can't see what we're trying to do.
I couldn't properly understand it at the weekend. I also think the quality of passing was a little bit disappointing. Guys were stuck inside shoulder. The ball was being shipped on. Bundy and Chris Farrell were doing the very best they could with bodies with defensive line in their face. I thought Keith Earls did as best as could be expected with minimal opportunity, but it was quite difficult to see. We hadn't seen it. We didn't see any kind of modifications to some of the tweaks that we saw against Wales the previous week. So I'm not entirely sure, considering the amount of possession that we did have, or what we were trying to do, or where we felt the space was. I guess we thought the space was out wide, considering how deep Ross Byrne was taking and how quickly he was shipping the pass, but that definitely wasn't the case.
Yeah, Keith, could you sum up in a line what you think Ireland were trying to do?
Yeah, no, I have to say I would struggle with it as well. I just think the game becomes incredibly difficult to figure out where the gaps are, unless it's wide, which it wasn't, when you don't take the ball on the gain line. And I'm not just saying this on Ross Byrne. I'd rather he was there, and I'd rather forwards somewhere around him in some level of an arrowhead or a pod of three, or whatever way it is. But when you're taking the ball into contact, you cannot be standing catching the ball. We have no Olympic sprinters who are so quick over the first 5 yards that they're going to do some damage. All you're going to do is truck it into contact. I just don't know that we're big enough for that in particular. So I'd rather guys running from depth. There's a bit of a cadence and a tempo if you do that. If you know that the scrum half is going to pass the ball, either to pass it to a forward coming in, and he's going to get smashed, by the way. This isn't as if this is a lovely, easy thing for him to go and do. He's going to get smashed with it. But it puts holes into the situation. And if you watch how other teams are doing it, they're putting a little bit of movement before the ball hits their hands, or they're trying to shift a little bit once they've caught the ball. But at the moment, we are taking the ball standing still. And with all the best will in the world, you could have every single plan that you'd like to have. But I think that dissolves because you're already on the back foot and you're already under pressure. It's very hard to win a collision under that instance, because and it's tricky because the way the laws are being interpreted now, where it becomes very easy for somebody else just to clamp onto that. So we need to be running in 2s and 3s, and that is a necessity.
Keith, sorry, Brian.
I think there's a bit of a lack of deception at the moment. That's the frustrating thing, and it is the one-out runners. And when you've got a team that have such defensive clarity as England clearly have, one high, one low, no logs on the ground, no one lying there, thinking that their job, they put in a great shot. Everybody is back to their feet, and it just feels as though you need to do something. There's a need for kind of some selfless, super hard running, where you feel as though you might be a viable option, but so does the guy outside you as well, and so does the guy out the back. And you all have to run as if you're about to get the ball and you're going to be collision winners with the ball in hand. Because if you're running half-hearted, the defence automatically can see that in your body language and realise they're not getting it, push off immediately, and that's where you get the big shots through the back of the attacking line as well. So just feels as though we need a little bit more variety to what we're doing to try and win that gain line. And we saw it a bit against Wales, but I think we really struggled because what we were talking about earlier on, we were on the back foot from the first collision at the very first ruck off every set play.
Yeah, and you'd have an insight into this. What you're describing there, that deception and all this joined up thinking, that sounds like a fair body of work to get through and to put an Irish stamp on. Are we as well off just booting the ball long and putting teams under good old-fashioned pressure then instead of all that?
No, because you have to play to how the players want to play as well. As I'm sure Chris Farrell and Bundy Aki don't want to be Gary Owen chasers. We'd like to think that the evolution of our game has moved on from that. We have a skillful team. We've got a team that are capable of scoring tries. Granted, it was a very disappointing Wales a couple of weeks ago, but we still created lots of great opportunities against them. So that's why those lads are playing, and not to break away from the end of the Joe era, but it just felt it became too contrived. And I think they want to play with a freedom and a fluidness that allows them to play that heads up. But you've got to do the basics to allow you to do that, and that is being collision winners, winning the ruck, getting on the front foot, slowing the defensive line down, and then you can create those deceptive situations to put people into space. I also think in all of this, we're missing our X Factor players. We're missing, Gary Ringrose. I think there's definitely, having seen him the last couple of weeks, there's a calling card for Dan Levy if he can get back to full fitness. These players that just add an extra dimension to the sides they're involved in. Jacob Stockdale looked really impressive when he came on in attack. So, I just feel as though we need to get all our best players out on the pitch against England if we're going to be in the mix to win the game.
Okay. Now, every question I've asked has funneled you down negative routes, obviously. that's just welcome to media. Any positives that you haven't had a chance to mention that you'd like to?
Well,
sorry, what are you going?
Brian, I think we played in Twickenham for a team that had their best team out in the field. They stopped us playing. Now, you have to give them a huge amount of credit. We often get just bogged down ourselves in our own negativity.
Yeah.
But they did exactly what they wanted to do. So they were chuffed afterwards. They wished they'd scored more and they wished they'd taken more opportunities. But they were chuffed in the manner in which they'd gone about the game, which shows you that that's what they were trying to do, right? So that's one part. I think the system things can get fixed. I also think that this particular competition is ideal for what's happening. It's getting players blooded, getting them used to the idea. I mean, I wrote a note on the game the other day, and just again for the hooker who's struggling, right? How does he know how adrenaline affects his throw in an international? Because he doesn't know, because he hasn't done it before. And you can throw 1,000 balls against a spot in the wall. You can hit that spot 970 times and say, my God, I'm pretty cool here at this. But there's an awful lot going on, and you're playing in a huge stadium against one of the best teams in the world. That puts an extra meter on the throw. Now, how is he going to ever know that until he experiences it? So he knows that that's something he has to learn and understand and factor into how he throws when he throws again, and that'll make it better for him again. I also think if we take the ball closer to the gain line, if we have our pods of three, which we had against France a little bit and definitely against Wales, that makes us more potent. It also exposes weaknesses if our handling isn't good enough, if different things happen. But that is a progression for something that we need to be able to do. Okay. And I do think, like Keenan, I thought at 15 he was in the right place for most of the time of the game. He looked as if he had time on the ball. He needs to be much stronger when he goes to ground, and he needed to be more assertive for the cross kick, though it was a perfect cross kick. So I think it was negative, but it isn't the end of the world, and I think the players and the team will be a lot better for it.
Okay. Brian, I'll give you a final word then on those points.
Yeah, just to kind of reinforce that, I think invaluable experience, that is huge, and there was scope for there to be a capitulation, at 18-0 down and nothing really go for them, and they'd thrown everything at them. But ultimately, I think lots of players stood up to the plate and rolled their sleeves up and realised this is going to be a slog. We mightn't win it, but there's a way to lose this. And to win the second half 7-6, I think is important, and they'll be talking about that. But you think about, there's lots of firsts there. James Lowe would have been thinking about making his international debut last week. It's a completely different story going over and playing against the beaten World Cup finalists in their backyard. Likewise, Keenan Farrell, I'm not sure he's played in Twickenham before. Kelleher, Caelan Doris, all these guys, this is a first for them all. And to experience the intensity and to understand the shock value that's involved in realizing, oh, this is the level we need to be at to be competitive on the world stage. Okay, sometimes until you get that proper shock, you don't really understand where that level is at. So I think they will be much better for having had it, and the fact that they hung in there and managed to conjure something up, and it's important that they weren't nilled, that they managed to get on the score sheet, considering how often they'd gone to the corner and had been denied on line-out mauls, to create a moment of magic that Billy Burns and Stockdale did. I think you've got to hang on to the positives, and I think there's a few, but there's plenty to work on as well. We also came up against one of the great defensive displays, so you need to put it in context around that as well.
Yes, okay. Gents, excellent. Thanks so much.
Cheers, Joe.
Cheers, Joe.
Monday Night Rugby on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, official sponsors of the Irish rugby team. Team of us. Everyone in.